Christ is risen. Christos voskres. Christos anesti. Christos voskrese. We got to do them all. We got to do them all. That's not all of them, I know. But today is the Apodosis, right? The last day of Paschal Tide for this year. Every day is Paschal Tide. We are living in the joy of the resurrection. But we can't do that continuously, so we have a liturgical schedule that helps us spiral upwards. Sorry about the technical problems here. I'm not going to blame the Russians, as tempting as it would be. The null hypothesis is always incompetence, especially when I'm doing something technical or that involves numbers. Today, we're going to have Father Harry back on with us, but I want to spend a little bit more time setting this up. Welcome to my porch, my back porch here in Hartwell, Georgia. Because the subject that we're going to talk about is a sensitive one, right? And we are living in the most polarized times of many of our adult lifetimes. You know, the late 60s, early 70s were similarly polarized. But it shows up in our politics. You know, if you just want to end a conversation and have it just turn into people talking past each other, bring up the president, just mention his name or allude to any of his qualities. And, you know, you're no longer talking people to people, person to person. You're talking a member of a tribe to another member of a tribe, or, you know, the echo chamber. You know, tribes just, yeah, rah, 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 rah. So much of that going on right now. And unfortunately, it's not just our politics. It's worked its way into our church because it's become it's how we have rewired ourselves. We have rewired ourselves into tribal members. Our responses are therefore tribal. And it's going to happen outside the domain of politics, right? It doesn't belong anywhere. But that's what's going on. And as a political scientist, political scientists track this through public opinion polling and things like this, and it's very clear how this is going on. And so the same thing happens now in our church, and it's just as heartbreaking as it is in our politics to see Americans divided over. I mean, here, let me just be honest with you, because it's driving me crazy. So instinctively defend a buffoon, and people instinctively defend someone who is incompetent. Now you can pick your which one you want to put that on. I tried to pick a word for each. It just shows how ludicrous it is that we would defend either one of these options. It's just, that's where we're at, though. I mean, and automatically y'all's hair's, back, right? Because I just brought it up. I just brought up, the buffoon, right? And the incompetent, right? Well, I don't care what your politics are. I am trying to push your buttons because I'm showing you how ridiculous this is. We got to rise above it and say, we got to do better. But as heartbreaking as it is to see us as Americans divided over this, divided over just, it is heartbreaking because I love this country. But you know what I love more? I love more Christ. I love more the church because it's the answer. It is the response. It is the peace. It is all of the things that this world needs. And that polarization has worked its way. It's an automatic response even within Orthodoxy. All you have to do, okay, so you don't bring up Trump, you bring up Patriarch Bartholomew, right? You bring up Ukrainian Autocephalous. And all of a sudden, just the tribal divisions appear. So Father Anthony is not a priest who serves his people sacrificially. Father Anthony is, if you are a member of the other tribe, a revisionist schismatic. Right? That's how someone would define me. And the members of my parish are revisionist schismatics. Not souls in need of salvation who have found their hope and their joy and their peace in our Lord Jesus Christ through Holy Orthodoxy. not men and women who have immersed themselves in the sacramental life of the church, who have given themselves over to the gospel of Jesus Christ. No, we're none of those things. Revisionist schismatics. That's where we're at, right? And it goes the other way as well. You know, the automatic, the visceral response against those who would so define us. And we have our justifications. You know, the people who are doing this on both sides, we're theologians. We know the big words. We know how to do this. We know how to make our case. But that's what we've become. We've become justifiers rather than listeners and lovers. And this is just completely heartbreaking. It makes me, as much as I love being a priest, some days it's too much to bear because of what we're doing to each other. We've got to rise above this. We've got to rise above this. So, what we're going to talk about today is difficult. And it's okay to disagree. You can disagree on this. Now, automatically, I've just put myself in one of the camps. Because one of the camps says, no, if you disagree on this, that's a sign that you're a revisionist schismatic, right? No, I'm Orthodox. And you know what? So are you. We could be doing it better, but we're both Orthodox. So we're going to talk about Autocephalous in Ukraine. And we're going to talk about the not the ecclesial politics. That's what I bring to the table, is the understanding of politics and cultural dynamics and things like this. Less interested in that. If you're interested in my take on that, I've published on it. What we're going to look at is the actual canon law and how it is variously interpreted. Yeah, sitting here much here. And so we're going to look at it that way. And what we're going to see is that you can be a reasonable person and defend both. And these both, they haven't just developed in response to this particular crisis that has occurred basically since 1989, but even before. This particular crisis. These are worldviews, ecclesial worldviews that have developed and reified within the two silos. You know what a silo is, right? You've got a pillar here and a pillar here is another way of putting it. And that's what's taught within these seminaries, but there's not a lot of cross-fertilization. Instead of they're just cross-sniping, right? But maybe not even much communication until we have a crisis. And then what we see all of a sudden is, wow, we're living in two different worlds when it comes to this specific problem. So in order for us to overcome this, it's not going to be through submission. One side is not going to beat the other over the head, right? And Lord willing, it won't be through the reification of schism. Lord, protect us from that. We pray in our morning prayers every morning. Heal our divisions. Protect us from schism. It's one of the first prayers of intercession that we do every morning as part of our morning prayers. Why? Because it's so tempting. If we're going to overcome this well in love, we have to do it by listening, by knowing, by understanding the heart of the people that are in this with us, but see things differently. We're not going to judge them according to our worldview, because that's not listening. That's demonization. Okay, we're going to know them as they understand themselves, and what we'll find out is that they are Orthodox, and we've got to work our way out of this mess. And in the future, the way we avoid this kind of thing is that we live a life of love, where we continually listen and witness and share, so that we don't find, when a new crisis comes up, that we've grown separate. The great schism, the schism between the East and the West, was a large part because they had stopped learning to understand each other. So love, in that kind of a situation, love without listening, understanding, is just an abstract concept. You know this if you've ever done marriage counseling. If they don't know each other, if they have not learned to listen to one another, how can they love? They are loving an abstract version of the other that they can't manipulate the way that they would like. It's not love. So let's begin with some understanding. So the topics that we're going to bring up, I guarantee you, everyone listening is going to hear something that they don't want to hear. And there's a possibility that we're wrong. We'll take correction. But just because we don't want to hear something, just because we can come up with a counter argument, doesn't mean that it's not something valid and true. Right? So, in order for us to get to a place where we can love when there are some serious emotional, there's emotional things going on, almost said triggers, but again, that would bring politics in, because that's such a political word now. We have to be peace. It's true in our marriages, it's true in our friendships, it's true in our parishes, and it's true in our church. Right? So in order to get to that place of peace, let's do this together. Let's say our Jesus prayer together for a minute. This means so much to me that y'all do this with me, and I hope it helps you as well. Ready? Okay. Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Now breathe in that joy. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, pause. And breathe out your relief. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Okay, we're in that space now. We're in that space where we can listen to the other. And this is that point. Marriage counseling, there's a point where you're like, this is no longer marriage counseling. This is negotiation for divorce, right? And for some people, they're at that point. I'm not there. I hope you're not there. Let's figure out how to love, how to bring love back into this, because it's the Lord's desire that we all be one as He is one. And we can only do that by climbing together. So let's bring on someone who is our subject matter expert on this. And there he is, and Christ is risen.
Indeed, He's risen.
Hey, it's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thank God. Thank God. Is it peaceful there in Florida?
Actually, I'm the only reason why I'm in my little inside space right now. I would be outside otherwise, but we have construction projects all around it. Construction projects all around the ground, so there's nowhere I can go without noise and people, and they'll be coming up to me and talking to me, and while we're on the show, I'll be like, I'm on a show, but
a sign of progress. So, I love it.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
so we were talking yesterday about living ecclesiology, right? And we were talking about how this coronavirus is a case study of the love that is incarnate in the institutions of the church. So it's not just about authority structures. It's about how love manifests itself in an incarnate organization, right? The church. And it was so wonderful yesterday being just participating in that after we had talked about it, right? So we had sent off our proposal for how we were going to keep our people safe as we ministered to them. And, we got to meet with the Synod of Bishops, the heirs of the apostles. And I am still, I spent years on the consistory, on the Metropolitan Council. I don't stop being awed by that, by this living continuity, and how awesome it is to be part of that structure of love, and to see there. So I've worked with a lot of authority structures. I was in the Army for 20 years. I know how authority works, and I know how it's necessary, and so on. What I really enjoyed about this is that it really was a kind and a positive process, right? It was, they're the bishops. They're the deciders. They're the ones who give the blessing, and they're also ones who have broader experience than I do. I know the experience of my parish deeply, right? but their experience is broader. They have more variation on the relevant concepts, and they listened to where we were, and we got to listen to what was going on, and just watching them pastor us and guide us, and we got a blessing. We got a blessing that we have a way to go forward to worship with our small community there in Waynesville. Glory to God. It's awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the kindness, right? Authority isn't always kind. And sometimes...
Well, and interesting.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, interestingly enough, so again, this goes to show you, that guided me, and I tried to figure out why the bishops had the direct audio conference, and I figured it out was because people interpret a tone when you're writing. So just in a letter, oh, this is heavy-handed, this is everything, and then the bishops are like, they have smiles on their faces as they're reading this thing. They're joyous and loving, and you're like, and they did that before they showed us the letter. That was very important.
Yeah.
So I did that. The same thing with my parish. I did a recorded message for people to retrieve when they could, because the last time, a few weeks ago, it didn't work having the meeting. We only had a few people that were able to do it at the same time. And it was watch this first, read this second, right? But I did the video release way ahead of time. And I explained that people interpret a tone that's not there sometimes. And anyway, that wisdom, which, we have to believe that grace is there in our bishops, and although people are not going to want to hear this, and in Patriarch Kirill and in Patriarch Bartholomew, they all received that divine grace. I know that's hurting everyone's ears right now. If you're feeling strong one way or the other, and it's down with one patriarch or down with the other, and they all received a distinctive divine grace. That doesn't mean, and we did as priests too, right? That doesn't mean we're always operating within it, but it does mean that we reverentially recognize it in them, and have that sense of awe, like you said, in approaching this topic.
Yeah, fantastic. So I want to give a little bit of setup, right? Because not everyone listening is familiar with the backstory, and we offer classes on this in seminary and in college. The history of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, the history of Orthodoxy, all these things, right? But people know the general contour of the story, but they've only heard one version of it, and come to find out, there are different ways to frame the facts. There are different ways that people know story. Right? So, we know we're about to celebrate Pentecost. It's coming up, right? Pentecost is certainly part of the story. The 11th century, the Great Schism, that's another part of the story. It doesn't come in directly into this one, but it's part of the context, right? Huge role to play in how you have a branching tree that happens historically in Ukraine. And that was certainly part of it, was the schism between East and West. And then you've got, 988. What a glorious time. Everybody celebrates this. When we call him Prince Volodymyr. I never understood that. I refuse to call him Prince. He stopped being a prince when he was the king over a certain territory. So call him a king. At least I do. He's not a prince. He was a ruler. Anyways, so Volodymyr, he accepted Christianity and brought his, the nation of Rus, people of Rus, into Christianity, into Orthodoxy, into the Eastern Rite. It was still a unified church. That's another huge part of the story. And that's where the framing of the story starts to change, right? So the framing, the way that I learned it in college, of course, was the Russian narrative, right? So the Russian narrative goes in 988, Russia in Kiev became Orthodox, and then, and then you bring in the Mongols and how Kiev was, right? But Orthodoxy was preserved in the East, right? So in Suzdal, Vladimir, Novgorod, then Moscow, and it flourished, right? That's the story. That's one of the stories, right? And Kiev became part of that. Ukraine became part of that. That's the Russian narrative, right? So then, if you're part of that narrative, and then you see, oh, Ukraine wants to be independent, they think, oh, Ukraine wants to be independent of what? Their Orthodox tradition? No, you haven't been listening because you only know your narrative. Here is how many Ukrainians understand their story, right? And no, Orthodoxy was not destroyed in Rus when the Mongols came through. It was decimated in Kiev, but it didn't just go east, it also found a safe haven to the west, right? And so these Kievan cultural traditions, Orthodox traditions, Orthodoxy was preserved there as well. It's dismissed now because of something that happened later with the Unia, when a lot of those churches, bishops, so on, went under Rome later on. But that is a different narrative. And so what you have is, if you're working within that narrative, when you hear, oh, the Ukrainians want autocephaly, yes, they want a restoration of their independence from Moscow, something that they enjoyed from the beginning because they knew themselves as being a church under Constantinople. So, anyways, I'm probably confusing this too much for people who aren't familiar with this story. But the next, a big moment occurred. A big moment in these stories occurred. Let's go. This is going to have to come up when you talk about interpretation of canon law. So, in the 15th century, it was things were tough, and in the 16th century, Orthodoxy was hard to do in what is now Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine. There was a lot of pressure to convert, and then you had the problems in Constantinople. You had the Council of Florence in the 15th century, and then you had the increasing strength of this neighbor, right, of Moscow. And then, the self-proclaimed Moscow Patriarchate. And so those set up the Union of Brest at the end of the 16th century. Okay, but even there, Orthodoxy, as an organic, local, Kievan, Rusin phenomenon, persevered. Not just under Rome, right? But it was restored. There was a kind of a rump organization there of the Orthodox. And it became normalized, still illegal because it was under, the Poles. But there was a church there under Constantinople with the recreation of the full structure, ecclesial structure in 1620. So what you end up with at that time, where there had been one Orthodox church under Constantinople, now by this time you've got two structures, right? One under Constantinople, and then another neighboring one under Moscow, and then a third one under Rome. But we're not going to talk about that today. Okay, and the Russian Orthodox Church had declared itself independent of Constantinople in 1589. Remember that communication thing? Communication was sundered. And then in 1686, here's a pivotal moment. The Ecumenical Patriarch transferred the Kievan Metropolia to Moscow. And we can talk about the language of that, because there's a lot that's been, you have to figure out exactly what was transferred, right? But it's seen, the way I see it is that was political pragmatism at best, simony at worst. And then the Ecumenical Patriarch renounced that in 1924 when he granted the Polish Orthodox Church Autocephalous. Okay, but regardless, what you have then is you have this reification of this structure, and Moscow had a legitimate say in what was now going to go on in what had been Constantinople's, you know, authority. Okay, so then the Russian Empire grew, and the Russian Empire politically used the church to Russify its, colonies, to include Ukraine. And to the extent that you weren't even allowed to serve in Slavonic with a Ukrainian accent. You had to use a specific pronunciation, much less serve in the vernacular. Okay, so anyways, so the peculiar, the local traditions, little t traditions of the Rusins, of the Kievans, were pushed out, and now they had a new word for them, is uniate, right? Which, uniate, oh no, that's too Catholic, right? So they were pushed out, and there was a Russification of the Orthodox Church there. Okay, and I am going to finish up with this. All this is to set up Father Harry so he can describe the ecclesiology, how the canons come in to interpret these things, right? So then, as soon as there was freedom, as soon as there was just a glimpse of freedom in the early 20th century, Ukrainian intelligentsia, Ukrainian clerics, what are called nationalists, but people who were pro-independence, they got together and they said, we need to have an independent autocephalous church, free of Moscow. It needs to be done in its own language. All right? So Orthodox, autocephalous, and local, in its own language. Right? And that did not fly, right, with the official Moscow Patriarchate, right? It wasn't allowed. And so you had the formation of the first iteration of the Autocephalous Church in Ukraine. And, it was, kind of by definition schismatic. It was very unfortunate. None of the bishops who had committed came, and so they self-ordained a bishop, right? And therefore set themselves outside the bounds of normal canonical orthodoxy, right? So that was the first iteration, and then the Soviets used it, right, because it helped divide people in Orthodoxy and the Ukrainians. And then they just destroyed it along with all remnants of Ukrainian nationalism. They tried to destroy all the leaders of it, and you can read Ann Applebaum's book about this. It's very accessible, and that culminates with the Holodomor, and just a terrible history. No one is going to defend that history, what was done to Ukraine. Right? And the destruction of this Ukrainian Orthodox spirit was supposed to be part of it. Of course, it endured. And as soon as there was another moment of freedom, it expressed itself again in the second iteration of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church. This time it had validly ordained bishops, right? Because of the Polish Autocephalous Church, right? And of course, one of our great figures, just bigger than life, Patriarch Mstislav, was part of that experience, right? And then the borders moved again. It was destroyed by the Soviets, the part of it in Ukraine. The spirit went back underground, right? And the parallel story of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, you've got to study it if you haven't. It's brutal. It shows you how awful communism is and how bad it is for church and state to get too wrapped up together. You end up making devil's bargains. And the Russian Orthodox Church got involved in some devil's bargains. Anyways, that worked its way west, so we have living remnants of that here, as well as of the first one. But then, it was destroyed, and then in the 80s, and especially in the 90s, as soon as freedom came back, again, Ukrainian autocephaly came back, and it came back big, with validly ordained bishops and so on. And so you end up in the 90s and into the present situation until, a couple years ago. You ended up with these parallel structures, and you have the one that's long been recognized as the Ukrainian Orthodox presence in Ukraine, which is the autonomous church under Moscow. And then you had one that was that dwarfed it in terms of public opinion by the time of autocephaly, not as large institutionally, and that was the Kievan Patriarchy, which was the largest, offshoot of that Autocephalous movement. And so the question was, how do we heal this? How do we overcome this? You have people who are Orthodox in rite, Orthodox in spirit, Orthodox in commitment, all of these things. And many of whom who had been born into that, right? It's not like they broke away from anything else. How do you bring them into orthodoxy? What can be done? Right? So this evangelical drive that we all are part of in America, how can we solve this fact that we're not in communion with everybody? How can we bring everybody in? You've got these people who are already doing everything you're doing, right? How can we bring them back? How can we solve this problem? And Moscow had one solution, and certainly Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA provided a different model. And the ecumenical patriarch sat on the sidelines for a long time, and then 2 years ago, really acted. So now we're back up to you, Father Harry. So if there's anything that you want to correct, I think we might have our Metropolitan with us. He hasn't said, Father Anthony, you got to correct something. So I think in general terms, we're handling things pretty well. So what are the relevant canons here? Who was right to act in Ukraine? Was it Moscow who said, no, we're going to wait until they repent and join our structure? Or was it the ecumenical patriarch who said, no, we've waited long enough, this needs to be healed, this is ultimately my jurisdiction, and then stepped in and brought them into orthodoxy and granted them autocephaly? What canons are they relying on? What kind of ecclesiology were both of them participating in when they did those things?
Yeah. So one of the things that we know that we've learned recently, as historians have delved deeper into this issue of Ukraine coming under Moscow, and so on, is that in fact um, simony, it wasn't actually as relevant a fact as we had thought. The ecumenical patriarch, the ecumenical patriarchate had actually sat on the fact. So the Cossack hetmanates had basically uh, voted in large block, right, and majority block 30 years prior to this. Now, 30 years is very important. It's a canonical amount of time when an ecclesiastical territory, when a period of dispute. Um, and so also for a primate, and especially the ecumenical patriarchate, it would be his job to see if this actually becomes a long-term political reality. So how long did he give it? Exactly 30 years. I mean, that's not a mistake there, right? And so it seems that was actually, he was doing his duty based on the hetmanate's decision 30 years before, and it stuck. And so Constantinople did that, but as we know, um, the thing that they did, that the ecumenical patriarch did, was allow the Metropolitan of Kiev to be ordained by the Metropolitan, by the Patriarch of Moscow, and also to sit on the synod in very similar terms to the way that the bishops of the Ecumenical Patriarchate lands in Greece sit on the Synod of Greece. Not that they belong to it entirely, right? But because they belong ultimately to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But because these political shifts happened, it was granted that this ecclesiological formation happens. And we know that this happened long ago. In the case of Alexandria, when Carthage collapsed, all of a sudden Alexandria had to take pastoral care of a lot of these other parishes in Libya and then beyond that, right? It was something that's happened many times in the church. But another thing I wanted to mention, and this is very relevant actually, is the term prince. The term prince and its usage, and especially amongst Christian rulers, um, including the Byzantine emperors and empresses. In the ecumenical, as we read through the Acts of the ecumenical councils, they're called prince. They're not called, uh, you know, that is their formal title, not emperor, grand emperor, bridge builder Pontifex Maximus, nothing like that. But prince are great princes. And the reason for that is a recognition of Christ as the King of Kings. Uh, so that this became, despite all their other titles, when in the church they're a prince under a king. So this is very kind of a beautiful thing, right? And we find that in the ecumenical councils, and also what we find in the ecumenical councils related to that is the term ecumenical patriarch and ecumenical patriarch specifically. And oftentimes we hear today that it shouldn't even be a term used anymore, right? It came about when John the Faster, Saint John the Faster, by the way, all of a sudden, he was called by the emperor ecumenical patriarch, and it came about, and it really shouldn't have. No, it's actually a recognized term in the ecumenical councils since then. So, in fact, as we read in the Sixth Ecumenical Council, um, the council addresses uh, the Pope of Rome as our most holy ecumenical pope, and the Patriarch of Constantinople is our most holy and ecumenical patriarch. Ecumenical councils, you might not like them, but they are there for us to deal with. And so, uh, yes, as with regard to Ukraine, the central issue is, what is an autocephaly, right? We have a new understanding of what autocephaly is. That's a wrong understanding today, and it's really an innovation of the past about 150 years. Um, and this actually fits into the whole narrative of the book, right? The whole, I shouldn't use the word narrative now. Even the word narrative, you can't use it. Because oh look, Father Harry developed a narrative, right? Because we have news narratives now, and they're all slanted. And no, this one I came into baby blind when I started this. So, um, and the and if anything, probably leaning the other way than what the conclusions wound up coming. But in any case, um, so this wrong view of autocephaly also came about at the same time where we had wrong views about the parish, wrong views about the diocese, wrong views about, yes, even the ancient patriarchates, which actually hold hold a special position within Orthodoxy, as we're going to see. Um, and the ancient, I should say, the ancient churches. So Cyprus, even though it's not a patriarchate, it's an autocephalous province, because it's not big enough to be a patriarchate is two or more provinces, right? And it only has one. So it will never be a patriarchate. Like people are talking about elevating that, because they don't understand the difference between an ecclesiastical province and an ecclesiastical patriarchate. But this concept of that an autocephaly is independent, um, is that that is is a modernist view of what autocephaly is. Um, and I uh, and again, the overall view of the book, uh, as you read it, is that there's two different views of ecclesiology, right? One's holism, and two different visions, I should say. One is holism, which is where we get the word Catholic, right? In the sense that, you know, By the way, the Orthodox Church has always officially been called the Orthodox Catholic Church. So it's really, we go back and you can find that in Orthodox Ecclesiology quotes, all the demonstrating that aspect. Um, Even though we've thrown it off in the past like 70 years, its usage. But anyway, in common practice. But that's where we get the word Catholic, right? We're one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We're God's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Catholic, kata, according to, and holos, which is according to the whole, right? So that's where we get holistic. And so, what is the difference there? Well, um, so autocephalism, what I call autocephalism, or autocephalous reductionism, is where we say the autocephaly is the highest we can go, and it's not answerable to anybody, right? That's the innovative. That's an innovative view on both sides. That's not orthodox, the traditional Orthodox view at all. It's not reconcilable to the canons at all. Um, and so, but so this view that no autocephaly is answerable is went horrifically wrong um, in in the 1800s, right? Late 1800s, resulting in the Council of 1872 and held in Constantinople, which ultimately made a ruling against philetism, tribalism. Ethnophiletismos actually is the term, so ethnic tribalism. Now we have beyond ethnic tribalism, we have sort of uh, you know, I would say you know two pillars, as you said, the silos, but they're just rooting. So the phelon, the tribes are forming around those two pillars, which, by the way, was Antioch's correct criticism of what was going on in the pre-planning of the Council of Crete. Was everyone was concerned about primarily about Moscow or Constantinople and what they thought. And Antioch's like, what about us? We have a place in the tradition of the church. By the way, we're an ancient patriarchate. As we look down through the acts of the ecumenical councils, it's amazing how these things go. And we have, for example, in the Seventh Ecumenical Council and the Fifth Ecumenical Council, we have um, the the ecumenical patriarch spoke first. And in answer to when they finally came to a decision, or even opening the council. So the ecumenical patriarch spoke first, and then um, a procedural announcement was made. The Pope of Alexandria spoke second, um, which, by the way, is the official name of the Patriarch of Alexandria, which is second in rank to the ecumenical patriarch in the Orthodox Church, and was the second in rank at those ecumenical councils at that time. And so Antioch spoke third, right? And it was third in rank. And to the next procedural thing, authoritatively, Jerusalem spoke fourth. And these ancient centers have a central place in the church. And so the ecumenical patriarchate wasn't getting its due, but also this the ancient churches, this bond of the ancient churches, and this really venerable, honorable position given to them by the ecumenical councils has also been ignored. And instead, it's been trying to either please the biggest kid on the block, which is Moscow, or fight against them. Right? He's getting bullyish. We got to get our forces together and go against it. But again, in all of these, we have to recognize the honorable position of apostolic authority. The canons, the pertinent canons, there's many, but I think the most overlooked one really is the authoritative, first canon of 879, which is known as the Council of Wisdom. It's also sometimes called the Eighth Ecumenical Council from the Orthodox side, right? We have this view of The 7 ecumenical councils have a special place, but councils with ecumenical authority didn't end there. It's also called the Reunion Council, the Photian Council, right? Referring to St. Photius being restored at that council. And Rome and Constantinople were at a breach for a few years there, at least portions of the ecumenical patriarchate, and there were uh, there was a healing of that temporary schism at that council. And what that council says, Canon 1 specifically of that council says, is that any judgment made by the Pope in Italy must be upheld by the ecumenical patriarch, and any judgment made by appeal from anywhere in the Christian world to the ecumenical patriarchate, to the ecumenical patriarch, must be upheld by the Pope. This is an incredible. So must be upheld by all bishops as final, and even including the Pope. This is an incredible thing, because it actually gives more weight of judgment. So more like Constantinople was the Supreme Court, so the Pope was kind of the president, as it were, but the ecumenical patriarchate was the Supreme Court in the church. And I don't want to get, we don't have a lot of time to go into that particular aspect today, but that was largely due to the resident synod of Constantinople at that time, in which we constantly had an ecumenical character to that. And a lot of people suggested doing that today, and I actually have that mentioned that in my book too, of this maybe that's what we need to do in Orthodoxy, is revive this home synod, Geneva, Switzerland, right at the center of the ecumenical patriarchate. Maybe might be a perfect place for this, but a revival where we have bishops in and out from all the different patriarchates, Autocephalous, and do that. So, but another central canon, and it's under such dispute, it really has been for quite a long time. By Orthodox standards, it's not a long time, but by our human personal length of life, it's a long time. It goes back to the early 20th century, really, and even before that. But this interpretation of Canon 28 of the Council of Chalcedon, and this sort of concentration of what this canon really means, and really almost all of the debate of the primacy of Constantinople comes around this canon in particular, and the particularly disputed in terms of modern terms, right? So that all these disputed, and again, fairly recently, 150 years, role of the patriarchate. That canon, it's rather lengthy, but it goes into the fact that Constantinople shall have equal seniorities to the Bishop of Rome. Okay, so what are these seniorities? Well, we see them back in the First Ecumenical Council. We see them in the Council of Sardica, and in the mid 4th century, and then we find them also in the Second Ecumenical Council in 381, where Constantinople is holds the seniority of honor, following that of the Bishop of Rome. So then the 28th Council of Chalcedon, which is the 4th Ecumenical Council, comes along and it gets even stronger language that there's equal seniorities with the Bishop of Rome. But it also adds some disputed parts about the barbarian, the term barbarian is used, and traditionally, of course, the understanding of the term that Constantinople shall be in charge of ordaining bishops in the barbarian lands was in in the barbarian lands was that barbarian referred to the territory, meaning it was outside of any autocephalous jurisdiction, right? So all of these were within the settled things, but the barbarian lands, not referring to people. By the way, that's not the Greek term used there. It's not the kind that you would say, oh, that person's a barbarian, right? It's referring specifically to the lands, and so, and again, referring to them as outside of the empire, but also outside of um, the the Autocephalous, by definition. So Constantinople was given that ability and authority. Now, what's disputed there is some claim that actually the term barbarian um, refers to people, right? And that this can be shifted and changed. That this refers to ethnic blocks of people, and so and hence our modern day time, even though condemned in Constantinople in 1872, this idea of that uh, that Moscow has authority over all Russians throughout all the world, and Romania has authority over all Romanians throughout the world, and this sort of overreaching parajurisdictionalism, which is foreign to our ecclesiology. So I don't know if I should pause here and have you ask any questions, or I mean, do you have any questions on that or thoughts?
Yeah, just a little bit more. So what we're establishing here, when it comes to the current dispute, is this self understanding of the ecumenical patriarch, right? That autocephaly doesn't mean independent, go on your own. That the ecumenical patriarchate serves as a kind of court of last resort, and also saw itself as having responsibility, where as the ultimate arbiter and maybe authority in those places where no firm authority exists, right?
Yeah,
And this is not something that the ecumenical patriarchs came up one day and said, "Huh, there's this dispute going on. See if we can make a case for." That's the way. That's lawyering, right? Is there anything in case law, canon law, where we can look back and we can establish our ability to come in and wedge our way into this? There was
right.
a holistic, an organic, a long-standing self-understanding that had been not just, it wasn't a delusion. It wasn't this, nobody else knew what the patriarch thought of himself, or as the emperor with no clothes, or something like that. It had been something that it was recognized by the way canon was done, by the way church was done, by the way relations with the ecumenical patriarch were managed by the other churches. So it's
Yeah,
not something that
yeah.
just showed up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as we go deeper into into the acts of the ecumenical councils, this becomes obvious in the Council of Chalcedon, right? Because there's this dispute of, the Roman legates are like, what is Constantinople trying to uh, gain power, and so there's uh, all these bishops then who stand up in the council, and from Pontus and Thrace and everything else, and they're like, actually, we voluntarily did this 100 years ago, right? Back before the days of Saint John Chrysostom. It was, we voluntarily did this. We needed Constantinople to help us out with these things, and so this has been the case already. It's just now being affirmed in the canons, um, and of course, still, Rome was suspicious of a power grab on that particular thing. But as I teach my students, the relevant canon, the operative canons for the authority of the ecumenical patriarchate really is not Canon 28 of Chalcedon. If we're looking at that council, it is really canons 9, and 17, both of which go into the fact that the ecumenical patriarchate has the right to hear an appeal from any exarch. Throughout any, so the form of appeal goes, uh, you know, of a to, obviously, a priest would go to a bishop. A bishop, if he's wronged by another bishop, would appeal to the local synod. But if there's a conflict, or of some sort, or if one bishop happens to be the metropolitan and the other bishop's not, and the metropolitan, so then then it says they can either appeal to the exarch, which was the term at that time. Just exarch means leader. Exarchos in Greek means leader. But and that it means something different today than it did in those canons. We didn't have the term patriarch quite yet at the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Instead, we had the term exarch, and this referred to all the patriarchates. So they could either go to their exarch, meaning their patriarch, to go to the patriarchal synod, or if they were worried that that would be impartial, to go before the throne of Constantinople. And again, we have two canons just in the Fourth Ecumenical Council on this. That is really the operative canons that establish the ecumenical. And there was, besides Rome, no one objected to this because it worked well, right? The ecumenical patriarch was constantly receiving all these other bishops from everywhere in the world, from inside and outside the empire, in and out and in and out. And whenever a problem needed solved, he said to his own synod, we're going to enlarge this. This is going to be, and it operated that way. It was a beautiful, natural way to have ecumenical like decisions made constantly in the church. So it was natural for this to come about, and this authority equal to Rome. And Rome got to really, as we see by the time of the Council of 879, the aforementioned, in which I mentioned the canons establishing the authority of the ecumenical patriarch. It's really even greater than which, by the way, it was the canon recognized by several popes, including the pope at the time. But we won't get stuck on that. But so by the time we got to there, Rome was still holding on to its title for old time's sake, and this is also an important lesson in the church, right? Because we hear say we don't need an ecumenical patriarch anymore and everything else. Well, there wouldn't have been one established by the ecumenical councils if that was the case. We needed one, right? And those canons are long gone, and days of old, and things of this nature. And no, they're still very relevant for us today, because what we have, without recognizing his role of gathering and arbitration in orthodoxy, is chaos. And that's what's going on today, is ecclesiological chaos in the church, where every autocephaly thinks it only answers to itself, which, by the way, never was an autocephalies were always interdependent. The term autocephaly comes from aftos, meaning self, and kephalos, meaning head, meaning that they elected their own primate without having to answer to anyone else on just that aspect. But once you become an autocephaly, you're answerable to the whole. That's it's ridiculous to think that an autocephaly is not answerable to the whole. So
okay, so
and so in the case of Ukraine, they appealed to the ecumenical patriarch, right? And I think for a long time, we had a sort of Irenic, Metropolitan Vladimir, who was under the Moscow, but was for the upholding of Ukrainian traditions and everything else, while he was still Metropolitan of Kiev. I think that there was a lot of hope that this would be able to go about better, right? Go about on better terms. Once he passed away, things are different now with Metropolitan Onofri, who has a different view. of ecclesiology and so on. But in any case, the ecumenical patriarch was hoping to get this into a pan-Orthodox council context, right? Moscow blocked it. They absolutely said, no, we're not going to create, of course, little did everyone know they weren't going to show up anyway. But we're not going to create if Ukraine's on the table. Right? So this came about, and so it was taken off the table. It was not on the table for the Council of Crete. And then Moscow boycotts Crete anyway. And so at this point, so again, this is the 30-year canon window. The appeal was made back in 1991, right? And that would give the expired tick-tock of appeal, of answering the appeal on 2021. So it had to be handled before then. Since Moscow obviously wouldn't even show up for the Council of Crete, it was obvious that this was not going to be solved that way. So the ecumenical patriarch took his prerogative, which is very obvious in these canons, ecumenically binding upon the Orthodox Church, right? In the Pedalion, in the Kormchaya Kniga, all these canons, universal, Canon 1 of the Council of Holy Wisdom of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia and Constantinople, and Canon 9 of Chalcedon, Canon 17 of Chalcedon, and a little bit Canon 28 of Chalcedon, but again, not as important as people make that one out to be. I mean, the equal seniorities part is important, but it's in terms of specifics on this issue, much more the other ones, and even Canon 3, of course, of Canon 3 of Constantinople 1. This is the Second Ecumenical Council, and finally Canon 36 of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, but we call it NCT, or Council in Trullo. So these canons, he it's not his right that he was exercising; it was his responsibility. Appeal was made that there was wrong that was done. It was, and so he had historians and independent historians go in and say, what is the real history here before we make a decision, before I call all of the episcopate of Constantinople together, because we're going to do this synodally. What is the information we need to have? And so that's where they delved in and went and got it. But when he exercised this right with regard to granting autocephaly to Ukraine, he was doing so fully within his rights, but more importantly within his responsibility. I people read Patriarch Bartholomew wrong. I really truly believe that, and I did. I think for a few years too. But he's he can't be negligent of his duty, and this is his duty, and he can't have ecclesiological chaos under his watch as ecumenical patriarch. He has to answer to Christ before this, and if this means making people mad because they don't like the canons, they think they're outdated, they think Constantinople's no longer should be ecumenical patriarchate because it's not even Constantinople anymore, right? It's Istanbul. This is the thing. He's just a bishop of Istanbul that's all he is anymore. And well, that's interesting because the Patriarch of Antioch has been in Damascus for well over half a millennium, and we still recognize him as Patriarch of Antioch, right? And so
okay, so
this yeah.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
you did a great job tying that up together. We've got one more trajectory here that
Okay.
so I can understand that worldview, right? And it has canonical support. It has, historical support. You can, this is not created out of scratch. We're going to tie these together in this new way to come up with this excuse to do something because we've been paid off for it or something like that. There's
Right.
another trajectory that's part of it though that I'm honestly I'm less comfortable with, and that is about how what it means when the ecumenical patriarch granted recognition of autocephaly and control over Kiev to Moscow, because the ecumenical patriarch, please correct me if I'm wrong, right? But there was the granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly. So we brought in these people who had been previously considered schismatics. We brought them back into Orthodoxy and then granted them Autocephaly. Said, you are the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. You are, responsible for Orthodox evangelism here. You're going to take care of the people. But there was a further step of saying, and by the way, there is no other truly legitimate Orthodox structure in Ukraine. Okay, where does that come
Yeah.
from?
Yeah. So this is something that a lot of us are not necessarily comfortable with, because however, they're not they're not declared anathema, right? So they're this is an important thing. Was, even though, yes, the ecumenical patriarchate said this is now the sole metropolitan of Kiev, right? Epiphany, and he is the sole metropolitan of Kiev. But one thing he didn't do was say, and by the way, uh, uh, you know, Metropolitan Onufri and everyone else who's united to him in synod with him, because they didn't join with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, anathema, or even something less, right? That we're blocking communion with. He didn't say any of that, because he knows it's a difficult situation, and so. And also because he cares about both sides, right? This is all about the fact that we had so many people out of communion with the church. He had the responsibility to make sure that they were brought back into world orthodoxy. It wasn't getting done. He waited and waited and waited for Moscow to do it, and they didn't do it. He did not want to do it. He did not want to do any of it, right? It was his responsibility. It finally was bearing heavy on his shoulders. He knew it wasn't going to get done any other way. It became evident he wasn't going to do it any other way. Now, so I will say, yes, this is, a lot of people it hits wrong. But if we look at this, right now, the Moscow jurisdiction in Ukraine is Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, has broken communion, right, with virtually all the rest of the world, along with its mother patriarchate. A lot of the Orthodox world, and but Constantinople, and now the Autocephalous Church of Ukraine, which, by the way, did a lot of things that I don't think Patriarch Bartholomew would approve of that they did, like giving, but he didn't interfere, because now they're their own autocephaly, right? So a Eastern Pope, as people like to call him, would not have done that. He would have tried to interfere, but instead, you had something that's virtually impossible happen. But now, thank God, it's corrected. But Metropolitan Filaret was given jurisdiction over the Diocese of Kiev, which is impossible, since what makes the Metropolitan of Kiev the Metropolitan of Kiev is that he's the Bishop of Kiev, right? So thank God that was corrected. But just from my point of view, I'm like, oh no, but he didn't interfere in any of it, right? It probably was like, oh my gosh, they make this big mistake right away, right? No, they're their own autocephaly. They got to figure this out now, and God bless you. God bless you. Any help you need, I'm here for you, right?
Okay. Yeah, very good. And I think you did a good job of framing this, the ecclesiology of love. These are souls. These are not concepts. This is not a concept of schism. These are souls in need of salvation, and the best way to assist in their salvation is to bring them into canonical orthodoxy. right? So a
Yes.
pastor acting within, he, like you said, he's not just doesn't, he can't find, it's not just that he can find the justification to act. He is, he has not just the authority to act, he's required to, as this pastor. He has his pastoral role. All right, now let's look at the other, you know, internally coherent, long-standing worldview. Right now, you say that the autocephaly idea, idea of autocephaly as independent, is fairly new. Remember, the Russian mindset, not just about ecclesiology, but about, you know, politics is empire, right? Is control over this empire, and that's going to, you know, the ecclesiology and political theory are going to kind of come together on this, and so they probably had this understanding of autocephaly is, no, this is us, and by the way, we're the biggest, so we should have the most influence on world orthodoxy as well. You know, first, second, third Rome, all this, right? So you have this understanding where we are at least autocephalous over, you know, our empire. We are at least that, and we were ceded control over Kiev. We would have exercised control anyways, but we ceded control. We were ceded control over it. 16th century, 16th, 17th. I'm sorry, terrible with numbers. If I ever say a number, raise your eyebrow. And they've been governing that territory ecclesiologically since then, with minor breaks, right? So, you know, ownership is 9/10 of the law. Control is 9/10 of the law, whatever that is, right? They've been doing it. The ecumenical patriarch has been acting as if Moscow had ultimate authority over Ukraine for a long time, since that time. So what's up with that? What's the canon that allows Moscow to say, this is our territory? This is a metropolia of the Russian Orthodox Church under Moscow. You can't just come in and say, we don't like the way you're doing things. Where are they coming from on that?
Right. So in this case, so because they're disputing the finding of the status, you know, the 300-year-old status of Kiev as a metropolia in its relationship to Moscow, right? They've uncovered the documents and so on, but they dispute that. So that's an important part, because if they recognized it, all of a sudden the relevant canons would no longer be applicable. And the relevant canons are once again going back to canons of Carthage, also canons of the Quinisex or Penthecti Council, the canons of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, essentially, um, in Trullo, and that this 30-year window, right? You have a 30-year window of dispute, and so from Moscow's point of view, so if this is the case that Constantinople did only give the right to ordain temporarily because of the impassibility, not impossibility, impassibility to get back and forth from Constantinople to the Metropolitan of Kiev, and also the ability to sit on the synod because of, again, that impassibility, that physical inability to journey for a synod. So they were able to do so. So if that did happen, the way that Constantinople says, then the canons on the 30 years are not applicable. But if it didn't happen, the Moscow's argument, when that's its position, right? That no, Kiev was given all totally over to us, period, the end, as subservient to part of Moscow, and you had 30 years to dispute it, and you didn't, and moreover, you recognized it, and that's it. So this is the kind of I mean, in terms of the facts of the case, I think almost the no one disagrees that if that was the case, but what Constantinople did is a matter of whether they were right or wrong in imposing those canons on if a 30 you have 30 years to dispute it. If not, that guy's been mowing your lawn for 30 years. Sorry, right? it, because for those of you who don't know, there's some places where if you mow part of another guy's lawn for long enough, it actually civilly becomes part of your property. So, but which is a little bit scary since you have elderly people who can't always mow their lawn. It makes me wonder if, but not getting off on that tangent. But a similar thing is going on with this. So it hinges on. I really think we have to get to the bottom of the legitimacy of which side is actually factually correct about Kiev's status 300 years ago when this whole thing took place. We really have to go deeper and look factually, and unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, I look, but dispassionately in the patristic sense, right? Meaning taking our emotion out of it and looking at it noetically, right? And because otherwise it's, emotions lead to a lot of bad things. I always say, it's spiritual stuff. The spiritual fathers tell us our soul kind of looks like a triangle, as it were, a trinity. And the part of the soul, the aspect of the soul, I shouldn't say part, aspect. Look at that. I'm using wrong terminology there. I'm using, we were talking about holism and reductionism. I'm using reductionist language, and I shouldn't be. So anyway, the aspect of the soul called the insensitive aspect that's angry, that also has emotions, of strong emotions. The spiritual fathers tell us that when that actually becomes in charge, which it shouldn't be, the nous should be in communion with God, right? Then what happens is exactly as if you tilled over a house, right? Or anything else. You can't function. You can't walk on the floor. Things start to rattle around. You get hurt. You can't turn the soul in a direction that God doesn't have structured. And that's what's going on in the whole church. Passions are flying, our fallen passions, but particular emotions are flying, and we're thinking with emotions. And as I always remind my parishioners, we need to feel with emotions. We need to think with our minds, not vice versa. But people love to do vice versa, right? They like to think with their emotions and feel with their minds. And that does not work out either. It winds up in a colossal disaster, which is what's going on today. So I don't know if I answered your question, but in any case, so there is a legitimate side from Moscow, right? It's a legitimate point. So we need to go further into those facts.
Right, because there is a canon that says that bishops don't mess with another's territory. Right?
There's more than one. Yeah, I mean, going all the way back to the Nicene canons, right? We can't. Now, interestingly enough, though, those who live in glass houses can't throw stones. So the metropolis of Korea now has intrusion, hyperorios, as we discussed yesterday, across the boundaries. So Moscow's argument was, well, you did it to us in Ukraine, we're doing it to you all over the world. That's it. And so now they're claiming a Russian Orthodox jurisdiction throughout the world, basically right now, which is very bizarre. I must say it's very bizarre that you're like, Constantinople did the wrong thing in Ukraine, therefore we're going to do the wrong thing throughout the world. So you really can't argue the border thing, and then at the same time be transgressing the borders of the Patriarchate of Alexandria. And so I don't want to get
let's stick with the current case, right? Let's stick with the current case. Okay. So the linchpin is what happened in 1686.
Correct.
right? And there has been the historical work. But, like you say, you have to look at it dispassionately. You have to admit that, hey, look, I might be wrong. I could be wrong. Maybe Moscow does. As much as I want to bring these people in, maybe I don't have a dog in that fight, right? Maybe we just can't do it. And on the other hand, maybe, oh well, you know what? I didn't get as much from them as I thought I did, and maybe autocephaly isn't what I thought it was. Right? And here I'm gonna put something on the screen. You won't be able to see this because you can't see what I'm sharing. But I'm gonna put up one of the documents that lays out the case. Hopefully, I think I'm going to that lays out the case for. There it is. So I'm showing them the thing that the Archons put out, the Ecumenical Patriarch and Ukrainian Autocephaly. And it's a series of essays, right? And this is available, it's free on the internet. You can get it. If you write me, I'll send you a copy. We read this in our class on Ukrainian Orthodox history this semester. And I'm going to point your attention to a couple. All the essays are certainly worth reading, right? So I'm slowly scrolling through them. The ones that make the cases that you want to read, or at least that I found the most interesting, are the ones by Archbishop Job, the Autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and the canonical prerogatives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, right? And then the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in granting autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine by Dr. Hartwell, right? And then you've got the Tomos itself is included in this. So even if you're like, no, I don't agree with y'all, Moscow is right, the Ecumenical Patriarch couldn't come in and do this. Yeah, well, look, you dominate the airwaves with your view. We understand your worldview, and even if we don't agree, we're sympathetic. We understand it. We get it. We get how this hurts. Please understand that we are not intentionally causing pain. Please understand us as well, so that we can love one another and not the demonization, these avatars that we've created, these straw men that we've created, so we can do a disservice to each other, right? So check that out, regardless of your thoughts on this. And I'm trying to bring us back, and my computer is messing up. So they can hear us, Father, but right now all they can see is this document that I've been sharing with you. So let's see.
Oh, okay.
Because this is so interesting, this software. Okay. All right, so here we are. I think they can see us now. So there you go. It comes. Look at this moment. Was complete control over Kiev given, or was we are going to give you the ability to select the metropolitan, but we're not ceding complete control to you, right? What's going on there? And there are other ways we can parse out history with parallel jurisdictions and things like this. But that really is the crux. What is the self-understanding of the Ecumenical Patriarch and autocephaly and his role in it? And it's not some kind of neo-papism, right? This is not a charitable understanding of this. What happened? What happened when in the 17th century? And what is Russia's understanding of autocephaly? And what happened in Kiev? And then we get to where we are. And here's where I will come out, and I'll say, those positions within their worldviews are defensible. What I will say is not defensible is to demonize the other and to cut off communion. To say that one side lacks grace. This is, where is that? What kind of orthodoxy is that? Because it's the kind of orthodoxy I would not have given up the love that I knew as a Methodist for it. Because it is a caricature of church.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, and this is ultimately, again, if the Ecumenical Patriarch was looking for a power grab, he could have done one. I mean, he could have easily done one. He would have been on this. And when I said he didn't want to do this, I meant he wanted it to be able to be worked out some other way, other than having this huge this huge thing. He wanted it to be able to internally be able to be worked out, and it wound up, um, you know, that's a long story by itself. But this love, it was out of love that this was done, because 11 million people are a lot of people. you know, to just say, to label someone schismatic, first of all, um, the the canons. When we read the canon, people read the canons, and this we talked about tone, right? The tone of and why the bishops read their letter to us. The tone of the canons as we read through acts of councils and everything else was schismatics was not a pejorative term towards someone, right? It was a factual term about the status of someone who left, who broke with the church, right? And formed their own. And there was parasynagogists, right? That's a long term, but related term to someone who broke. But and then there, but the problem is that they were not used the way they are now. They're weaponized terms, right? And schism is a weaponized term, and this is a problem. So this leaves the love that we see in the church and the misuse of canonical language,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
So here's where I come in as a political scientist, right? And who studies, manipulation, public opinion, culture, right? For a long time, an enemy of the Soviet Union, a legitimate enemy of the Soviet Union and of Moscow were Ukrainian nationalists. There was a whole series of adjectives that were always placed along with, Ukrainian nationalists. They are, fascist, they're Nazi, they're schismatic. You've got this whole length, a whole long line. And it's very useful as a propagandist to do that, right? Because anytime you can demonize the other well, you strengthen your own tribe. And they become here's my role, my charitable understanding, because this is clear. I mean, you just look back at it. Every description of Ukrainian nationalists, they're this, that, and the other. And then they start believing their own press. And they can't recognize the Ukrainian nationalist, right, as anything other than an enemy. Not someone who's worthy of love, worthy of reconciliation, worthy of sacrifice on behalf of. Instead, they are only the other. They need to be outside the bounds. And, it's so hard to move outside of your own press. You become captive to it. It begins to define you. And we can't have that. And we can't allow it to happen with us in our understanding of our brothers and sisters in Russia. We can't allow it to happen to our brothers and sisters in the Republican or Democratic Party. We just cannot be captured to press, to propaganda, to agitation. We have to, like you said, we have to move up. Our nous, the part that is, that connection with God, where we learn things in peace and love, and we understand harmony through our connection with Him. That's where we have to be. We cannot allow... Yeah, go on.
Oh, no. I was going to say, and this inflammatory language comes from both sides, but I'll say it's worse than inflammatory language. Because if you accused me of any grievous sin, let's pick one. You accused me of murder, right? And I didn't murder anyone, but it doesn't matter. You accused me of murder to demonize me, right? And this is not just... this is not no small matter. It of itself is a grievous sin, a mortal sin, and the to bear false witness, to accuse someone of doing a grievous sin. So the same thing, murder. If you falsely accuse someone of theft, if you falsely accuse someone of adultery, right? This is bearing false. This is the utmost evil, right? So if you're falsely accusing someone of schism who is not in schism, is not committing that sin, or worse yet, heresy. Right? We've seen heresy, and this term flung at not just hierarchs but patriarchs, and the ecumenical patriarchate particularly. Um, this is one, and falsely, by people who don't even know what the term means or how it's properly used. Armchair theologians, as we call them, right? Everyone who has a voice now on Facebook thinks that they can say whatever they want, but these things have consequences. Christ says every idle word that we use, and that means idle words done on the keyboard too. Um, if we're falsely accusing someone of murder, or any grievous sin, including heresy and schism, we are going to pay for it. We are going to pay for it, either in this age or the age to come. And again, by pay for it, I mean that even if God doesn't swing a judgment gavel, it's built into the system. When we depart in a grievous way from the goodness of natural order as God created it, which includes the moral order, there will be already consequences for it. Comes down, it causes a massive, not just ripple effect, but a tsunami wave at the end of it, and it will come back, hit the wall, and bounce back at us. And these are destroyers of the church, as we read back in different times, going all the way back to Hegesippus, who said that, basically, so we're going all the way back, 1800 years ago, to where that those who would rip apart the church, right? And then we have a little bit later on, that in the 5th century, the saying that those who would rip apart the body of Christ, that they might just dismember him and then spew it out, right? And so on. So in other words, not to partake of the flesh for eternal life, the body of Christ, but rather to try and destroy it. And even those who are doing it not intending to do that per se, are still intending sin, right? So this is a grievous. I can't emphasize that enough. When I see this online, using words so lightly as heresy and schism, um, and what it does to people too, right? It's dividing the church by using these terms lightly and wrongly. And so I would urge everybody to stop doing it. Stop using those terms, because that's very serious charges. So.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. And time can heal this. It can heal this, but it can also reify this division. We have to be very careful. This is a pivotal moment. So here on the local level, what we can do, we can't control things outside of our out of our sphere, right? We can only influence things around us. But in my own heart, I'm going to resist the temptation to objectify and judge others. I'm going to try and listen and understand and love. We can start with that. That'll change the world. And I pray for. And then the other thing I can do is I can behave with priests that are on that other side, right? As if they were my brothers in Christ. With the other priests as their brothers in Christ. Because we have 99% of the things that we do in common. And then they will be, hopefully, obligated to do the same, right? We won't be celebrating together, right? But at least we'll be brothers. But you can't do that online, unfortunately, because, you start to do that, and then the children jump in when the adults are talking and start to dominate the conversation, right? But another thing that we need to do is we need to pray for the restoration of communion. Because that, it'll bring us back to ourselves. I certainly hope it'll bring us back to ourselves. And unfortunately for us as Americans, this particular schism is happening on top of one that was healed ecclesiologically, but it wasn't healed culturally. It wasn't healed relationally. And that is the ROCOR. For so long it defined itself as standing against, right? And then thank God that schism was healed and they were brought back in. We celebrated that. We really did. We celebrated them being brought back. But there was no repentance. We are sorry for calling you pan-heretics. We are sorry for labeling you as, ecumenists or whatever it is. Okay, there was no healing of those wounds. And so, as that is still, it became latent because we developed relationships, right? But it wasn't dealt with, so it's still this latent thing, a part of the identity. And now, it just comes back and it comes to the fore. And that's a deadly combination. That's just a deadly combination. So, we suffer from the mistakes of the past. We do. And that's not the only mistake that we're suffering from. Well, Father Harry, you know what? You just spent more than an hour and a half with me on this, and I really do appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise. You are a blessing, not just because you remember dates and you remember all these canons and you've read these and you've written on it. You're a subject matter expert on it. But also because you look at these things in love with a Christian heart. Because otherwise it's just the tongues of men and angels, right? If we don't have that, it's just clashing cymbals, right? That divide us and cause noise in the world. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your witness.
Thank you, Father.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
And all y'all, thanks for coming in and spending this time with us. If you have any questions or comments, hey, look, even if you don't agree, great. We're still brothers and sisters. You don't have to agree with me on everything. You don't have to agree with Father Harry on everything. We can handle that. You know what? Because we're adults. And we love you. All right. If you like this, subscribe, and all that. And buy the book. In every church. Available at Amazon. And it really is that good. And this love, it's not just... It does have all the facts in there that you'd want to see. All the, the scripture... all of the canon law, all of the interpretation of canons, but it's also informed by that love. That love, because that's the real thing that hangs on those bones of, apostolic succession and so on. All right. So, well, until next time, which will be next week, Godspeed.